So what today's webinar is about, we want to talk about debt recycling. So a simple breakdown of how to structure your money to build wealth sooner. To help me go through it, we've got Terry Condon. So Terry is the owner of the Cashflow Co. And we've also got Craig Bigelow, who head of partnerships, I believe is the official title there, Bigsy.
Yeah, that'll do.
That'll do. But Tez, maybe I'll hand it over to you just for a brief intro on yourself.
Yeah. Cashflow Co. We help a lot of young families build a bit of structure and system around the way they manage their cash flow to be able to get their goals funded. You and I have a long history, mate. I used to work with you at Richmond. We both came out of sport, and really I've just applied that coaching model into money. So that's essentially what I've been doing for the last 8 years, and love to see what folks get up to, and that's what I spend my time doing.
Awesome, mate. Yeah, that's 14 years ago now. It does certainly feel like another lifetime, doesn't it? Yeah. And Craig, tell us a little bit about what you're doing there at Alcove.
Yeah, so Alcove we've sort of had various name changes over the years, but the consistent message through there is just trying to help people make the right moves with their property, which then falls through to how they structure their financing piece of it. We do a lot of work with advisors and other people that are working with our end customer to provide these educational updates to help people to make that right decision. But ultimately, we've got a team of brokers that provide the finance solution when that correct decision has been made.
Yeah, awesome. And obviously a pivotal part when we're looking at things like debt recycling and other leveraging strategies, having a quality broker on your side to help navigate bank policies, structuring, the hundreds of different considerations when you're going down that path is obviously pretty crucial. So happy to have you here, mate, and hear your input for today.
Thank you.
Just the compliance stuff. Obviously, I don't know anyone's personal. Well, I don't make the assumption. I don't know anyone's personal circumstances in the audience. So, nothing in this is personal financial advice. Shouldn't be taken as such. And, you should consider consulting a qualified professional before implementing any of the strategies discussed today. So just for the agenda, what we are going to talk about is the strategy in a little bit more detail. We'll then talk about, or we'll show you a bit of a simulation that's been built so you can potentially apply your own circumstances to have a look at, what the upside is for you if you were to go down this path. And then we're going to get a little bit more into the weeds just around some of, a bit of a playbook for how to do it right. What are some of the pitfalls and traps to be mindful of? And how can we minimise those risks to maximise the reward? We'll then lastly also talk about, who is this for and who also may it not be suitable for as well. So debt recycling, maybe Terry, I'll hand over to you because you're quite good with your words. What's debt recycling mean to you?
Mate, literally, it's on the page. A smart way to use equity in your home and start investing sooner. I think it's probably the best legal cheat code that Aussie homeowners have. A lot of people know about it, just a lot of people don't do it. It's how we get out from under our non-deductible debt, start getting debt working for us, because equity always grows faster than we can save. So I kind of consider it like a bit of a travelator. Where everybody else is running to get to the plane, you can just jump on the travelator and go a bit faster. That's really what it's about.
And it's really interesting in that short description there, a smart way to use equity in your home and start investing sooner. Because when people approach me about debt recycling, that description doesn't mention probably the two benefits that I think are pushed out there on YouTube and LinkedIn, TikTok and all that. So a lot of people, I think, when they think about debt recycling, it's a way to pay off my home sooner and get better tax outcomes. But I guess what we've got here is that's not the predominant benefit or purpose of debt recycling. What we want to do is, utilize leverage and just get invested sooner. They're the two main benefits to this whole strategy, right?
Yeah, I think one thing I'd just add to that, Jayden, sorry, just to
right.
sort of push on that point of sooner, why it's so important is because the sooner your money is at work, the harder it tends to work. And that's actually the whole benefit.
Exactly, yeah.
So the alternative is just pay down your mortgage until you're mortgage free and then start investing. So essentially it's like, instead of doing that, what if you started building equity outside of your home sooner?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I mentioned one of the predominant benefits that is pushed out there by a lot of people trying to sell this strategy is the ability to, reduce your non-deductible debt. And Craig, given we're talking about debt, I might let you talk a little bit about, what's non-deductible debt, what's deductible debt, and how does it all relate?
Yeah, perfect. So you put it again on the slides, believe it or not. But
It's just to
essentially,
help you, mate, just in case you forgot.
thank you. I really appreciate the leg up. With the non-deductible, it's typically debt that you hold which doesn't produce an income, whereas the deductible debt is typically debt that generates the income, which you're allowed to then use effectively with your tax reduction. So the most simple one to look at, non-deductible example, would be your family home that you live in, and the deductible debt being an investment property. How the two differs: they're both mortgages, but one helps you from a tax perspective and the other one doesn't.
Yep, perfect. So as we said, debt recycling is the act of productive equity in your home to borrow and invest in assets that grow and produce an income. So the way debt recycling, as I mentioned before, is espoused online, it's quite a prescriptive strategy. And I want to get really clear that all debt recycling is, it's just a strategy. Okay, but the way most people know it is online, it's quite prescriptive in that you've got equity in your home, you borrow against the home, you get that equity invested in the markets, typically high income producing assets, because then you use that income from those investments to then pay down your home loan, which is the non-deductible debt, as Craig said. Okay, and then you just keep recycling that whole strategy in perpetuity until you've accelerated at the rate at which you pay down your home loan and eventually extinguish that home loan. So Tez, I'll start with you on this one, but why would you do it?
Yeah, I just think, as I said before, like if you are just purely paying down debt, it is kind of seductive because you can kind of see it and you can see that progress. But your saved dollar doesn't work as hard if it's only going into the mortgage versus building out equity across a bigger capital base. So if you do want to make every dollar saved work harder, it's better to think about building equity than it is about paying down debt in that way. Because if we do have two properties, or even a property and an investment portfolio, the growth on that capital base is going to be a bigger number than the growth on. Actually, you don't get really any return in the actual house that you save into. So there is no kind of return on that equity. It's just you paying into it. It doesn't increase the value of that property in any way. So it's just, if you want to make that saved dollar work harder, you do have to start thinking, invert it and start thinking, no, I want to build equity, not pay down debt. I'm not sure if that makes sense. Is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I think it's perfect. And I might even let Craig touch on the next bit around, you mentioned the really great analogy about the travelator, and it's a way to grow your wealth faster. And again, I think the main part in that helps us do it is the leverage piece. So, you said you could do it in property, you could do it in shares. Craig, I might again hand it over to you to sort of explain a little bit more about how leverage works in terms of this strategy in helping you grow your wealth faster.
Yeah, I think there's 2 points to it. So I guess it's the use of the time. So if you take things that you can control, history has shown that the longer you're in something, the better it is for you. So if you're doing it now versus doing it in the future state, there's a benefit to that. But also the more that you've had in something over that same extra time has shown to be an accelerator in that method too. So this is just the way of doing that, both of those pieces. It's both got upside and downside exposure. So like both directional returns are magnified with leverage, but the whole idea of it is that the more time you have, that's where the benefit of that helps as well to smooth those downside risks. And so the combination of the leverage and the time is the thing that really helps this strategy out.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that because there's a really great stat, I think, on Warren Buffett. Most of us know Warren Buffett, the famed investor from Berkshire Hathaway. But a really interesting thing I heard is that 98%, could even be more now, of Warren Buffett's wealth was made after he turned 65. So he has just been doing it longer and better than anyone. But I think it's the length of time that he's been doing it which explains most of his success. So, being able to get into the market sooner is one of the biggest indicators of how successful you're going to be over the longer term as well.
Yeah.
And then, the other benefit you can use is, by recycling your debt around and using the income from the investments, you can, if you want to, potentially reduce your home loan quicker. So slash the biggest expense of your life, which is probably going to be that non-deductible interest, potentially next to tax, but it's still a bloody big expense for the majority of us. And, you can potentially do it without having to live on less as well. Why do most people not do this? Tez, I'm going to pick on you again, just because I know a little bit about your personal story and how you got into, the industry that you're in now. Build a bit of cash, a little bit of mistrust, different relationships with money, and it took a lot for you actually to start getting invested. And I imagine, a lot of those will be true for other people when they think about debt recycling as a strategy.
Yeah, look, I think one thing I notice about the finance industry is it's very, very clever at making the average person feel dumb. There's a lot of 6-syllable words that actually mean very simple things. And so that is it literally is a completely different language. And so it's very easy to feel intimidated by this. And with debt recycling as a strategy, I mean, even the word debt is a loaded term, right? Like, it comes with its own associations. How do we feel about that? How do you feel about debt? Debt is, if you think about people think in metaphors. The metaphor that most people think in when it comes to debt is slavery. Debt is a burden. We don't necessarily think about debt as a tool. And this is a real kind of paradigm shift. It's getting you to think a little bit more strategically and possibly just making you think a bit more with your higher order thinking, what you actually want. So I think most people don't do it just because there is a few moving parts. It's probably not something that you do want to do yourself because you want to go through that process with somebody who's done it correctly. And we're going to talk later about setting it up correctly to make sure that you can get the benefits right. And so it does require a bit of trust. It requires a bit of trust in yourself to be able to see it through. It requires some trust in others as well. And typically the finance space is a very low trust space. So I'm not sure if that's what you specifically wanted me to talk through, but
No.
Yeah.
No, it certainly helps. And I think, as you said, when we're unsure, uneasy, and, potentially feel dumb, a lot of us, for fear of judgment, for fear of making a bad decision, will just not seek help. Well, it's much easier to put our head in the sand and stick with the status quo than it is to get out there and, be really proactive. And I like the term, Tez, you always use, which is the NPC. The non-playing character, the person that's just sort of happy to go along by default and sort of be led by the computer.
Yeah.
One of the other ones, which, probably comes back to the Warren Buffett thing, is for a lot of people, it's really, really hard to see progress at first. And we've got a little bit of an image there which sort of helps illustrate it. And, back to Warren Buffett, like, this might be age 65 for Warren. Okay. And look what happens, in the last 20, 30 years of his life. He did start earlier, but I mean, he's also amounted quite a significant fortune, like in the billions and billions of dollars. And, not all of us may strive to get there. So, but what we want to do is just really start that investing journey sooner, because the longer you're in it, these are start to become some of the returns. And you see, in the last two bar graphs there, the differences between each of the preceding ones is almost the sum of the first 5 or 6. Okay, so it's hard to see progress at first. It's hard to stick to it, but if you do stick to it long enough, and compounding interest is the 8th wonder of the world, you get paid off at the back end of life. And I think the third one of why most people don't do it, it's like, well, hang on, you're telling me the bank's going to give me money, I can go invest it and get more money than I have to pay the bank, plus I'm also going to get a tax benefit and potentially reduce my home loan quicker at the same time. Nah, that can't be right. What are we always told? If it sounds too good to be true, it usually isn't, right? Do you think there's anything else where we've missed there, Craig or Tez, as why someone else potentially wouldn't go down this path?
No, I think the last one's pretty poignant, though. It is. It just does seem like, oh, yeah, really? It seems like a free kick, and it literally is. And it might be worth maybe just very quickly, Posty, just talking through like why would the government want to incentivise us in this way? Because there is a reason.
Yep. Yeah, and it is all about incentives. So if I've got a lump sum of capital or I've got equity, the government wants to incentivise people to put that equity or capital to work. Okay, if I don't have an incentive to take on the risk to start a business, I may not do it. There's obviously incentive that I get growth, but the government tries to make that easier by providing us with tax benefits for people who are willing to put that capital to work and basically take risks for the benefit of everyone else. Because if there's no people willing to do that to start businesses, no one's got jobs. We don't see any progress in humanity. And that's why those incentives are really important, just to give people a little bit more confidence or a little bit more backing to say, hey, if you're going to do this, we're going to give you a tax break. We're going to give you, these structures that can help mitigate the risk of, the other capital you've got if you make a mistake. Do you think that answers the question, Tex?
Yeah, I reckon it does. Yeah.
So first off, I just want to talk about a little case study. These are some clients that we worked with at Cruise, started working with them in 2024. I've obviously changed their names, but David and Sarah came to us. They'd just bought their dream home. Okay, they're over in WA. They'd bought a home for about 1.1 million at that stage. They had a property that they already owned, were living in, and moved out of to buy this dream home. Okay, and they were always told, you never sell a property. Property's great, you keep property, and if you buy the right property, that's certainly true for a lot of people. Okay, but he was on a big income. Sarah had gone back to studying nursing. They had a son that was, starting to get a little bit more independent. Sarah wanted to get back into nursing. She'd done her master's and was just about to get back into the workforce. But David was on a really good income. He had a RSU, so an employee share scheme, as a part of his overall compensation package, but he was on about 300K in income himself. And they also had a few other shares, largely being in the tech company he worked for, plus they also had what's called an investment bond, where they were putting some money away for their son when he could potentially turn 25 to give him a bit of a leg up. They also had about $400,000 in super, and at this stage they were turning 50 in 2025, so that happened the next year. But what was really interesting, well, on paper things looked good. They had the dream home, he had the big salary, they had an investment property, investment, super was tracking along well. One thing that they said to me was, we feel like we've got the dream home, we just can't enjoy it. We feel like after tax, after mortgage repayments, even with the rental income coming in, there's just really nothing left for us to do some of the things we want. Now, they did have the dream home, but it still needed a bit of work. They needed to do things in the front yard. The veranda needed some work. There was a laundry and kitchen that needed some stuff done. And one of the big things for them is they'd always dreamed of, going over to Italy for their 50th together. Having a nice family holiday, spending a month or so over there and being able to enjoy it. But they just couldn't see it happening because there was no space for savings. So we did a few things for these guys. And the first thing we did is we helped them really understand, okay, well, what is this all for? What are we really optimizing for? We fleshed out that although David was on a really big income, work was really stressful, and he felt chained to that job purely just because of the income. He said if he could get out of it in 5 years, he absolutely would. Okay? The other thing is they had no idea either on when they were going to be able to retire. Although it was probably still a fair while away, they just had no clarity around what the path for them looked like and when they could eventually call it a day. So he said he wanted to leave his job in potentially 5 years, but he also had no idea what sort of income he'd be able to go down to, because it would most likely be a cut in income, and then had no idea what that would mean for how long he'd have to work post that. So what we did for these guys, once we'd uncovered all the things that they wanted, we had a look at what's the most appropriate strategy. Okay, we moved some things around. We got them into a position where we reduced the home mortgage to $200,000 only. We increased their surplus cash flow to about $3,000 a month. We helped get them into a position where they could fund a trip to Italy. They didn't go in 2025, but it's booked and ready to go this year, so it's a big 51st trip. Okay, and then what we did is we spoke about, well, now we're in this great position. You've got about $900,000 of equity in your family home, and you've also got $3,000 in savings a month. What do we do with this? How do we get that money to work for us? And that's where debt recycling came in. So we've built a little bit of a calculator since that point in time, which just can sort of help illustrate some of the benefits of a strategy like this. So for these guys, I'm just going to focus on David because we've built this to be very simplistic. So we don't want to focus too much on joint incomes and the differences between it. But he was on $300,000. He was earning they were saving $3,000 a month. Their home was worth about 1.1, and we got their mortgage down to $200,000. Okay, because we just refinanced, the mortgage remaining term had gone back out to 30 years. Okay, and their repayment type was principal and interest. Now, I said earlier on the webinar that debt recycling, it's a very prescriptive strategy. Okay, it is, I borrow money against the home, I look to fund investments with that equity or that borrowings. I look for high income producing assets that I then use to accelerate the rate at which I pay down my home loan. So that is debt recycling there as fully prescribed. Option one for these guys would be to do nothing and just focus on paying down the home loan with their surplus cash flow. Okay, not worry about investing until that home was paid off and then they could potentially get started. We could then debt recycle as I just described it, but debt recycling has other layers and other things to consider. With our surplus cash flow, if I'm going to expect, let's call it 9% from an investment, both from income and the return on capital, so if my investment's worth $10,000 today and then it grows to $15,000 after 12 months, that's our growth rate. If I'm going to expect a 9% return and the interest rate on this leverage is only 6.5%, why wouldn't I just keep putting all my surplus cash flow into that investment as well? It's obviously a high risk strategy because we're looking at funneling more money into the investments as opposed to prioritising paying off debt, but it's certainly an option for people with the right risk capacity to potentially consider. The next thing we need to think about when it comes to debt recycling is, what are my investment preferences? Do I really want to invest for income because I am obsessed with paying down the home loan sooner? Am I happy to be a bit more diversified and find a bit of a better balance because I'm not overly too fussed and I just want to potentially take the least amount of risk with my investments? Or maybe I'm all about growth. I want to build as much assets as possible. I want my investment portfolio to grow. That's all I care about. The mortgage is fine, no problem at all. So depending on those choices for these guys, we just wanted to debt recycle. We also wanted to go balanced. It was really important for them to get that mortgage gone, get rid of that cash flow surplus. So for David, he could look to move out of his role as soon as possible. Okay, so they had that lifestyle factor that was hanging over their head. So, but when we run this simulation, what you'll see here is if we just did nothing, if we just focus on paying down the home loan, here's our potential outcomes over a 20-year period. Look at the difference if I just put that equity to work and debt recycle. It's almost double. In our simulator, we can also talk about, it illustrates some of the changes. So the expected increase in home value, the expected increase in your investment portfolio, how quickly you pay off your home loan, your investment loan balance every time it looks at debt recycling, how it impacts your surplus cash flow year on year. All right, and we can see that all there under each of those different scenarios as well. All right. The other thing we'll be able to see is how do the impacts of the different investment preferences affect my overall outcomes. All right. And what we'll see here, basically compared to the standard strategy of just focusing on paying off your home loan, although my total debt is a lot higher, I mean, I'm not sure about anyone else in the room, but I would rather have $6 million in assets and $1.8 million in debt, meaning my total net worth is about $4.5 million, compared to just having a house paid off, no debt, and a bit of an investment portfolio as well. Des?
Interesting point on that part, mate, is just again like another paradigm shift in the example that you just gave there. So I would consider your home is actually paid off. It's just that the money isn't in the home. And if you can start to see it more like that, you can start to change your thinking from paying down debt to building equity. And once you get to a certain point, the point I kind of like to call it escape velocity, where you sort of say, well, if I was to sell things down, I'd be able to pay down this home loan anyway. So technically, I am mortgage free. It's just that I've chosen not to pay off the mortgage in total yet. And I think if you can start to see it that way, you give yourself a lot more options, a lot more choices, and you can buy yourself a lot more time here with the money that you can grow.
Yeah, absolutely, mate. Yeah. And I think that's the big thing is with an investment portfolio that's large or an asset base that large, all you bought is a lot of optionality.
And I just think the other thing to note there too, if you just go back up to your numbers where it looked at the different year breakdown, and maybe even the home loan balance in one of those scenarios where it got paid off in 3, I think it was one of the other ones that showed that the debt recycling, it paid it off. Like you're basically debt free in between year 3 and year 4. So I guess the debt recycling stops at that point, right? Because there's nothing to recycle.
That's right. No.
So I think it's just a really interesting point to note that it's only debt recycling. You mentioned it being a strategy. It's a strategy while it exists, and then it's just leverage. You know what I mean? So
yeah.
I think it's a really interesting. Like numbers don't really tell a story on their own, and they require words, which is why we all speak. So I think it's nice to sort of put some language around it, and I think you guys are excellent at this too. But I think it's a good call out that. I'm sure we talk about it later in terms of who it's for and who it's not, but it does require having a debt to recycle to be debt recycling.
Absolutely. And I think at the core of it, that's why I think the debt recycling monkey that gets bandied around is a bit incorrect, because it's focusing on that really prescriptive strategy where really we're just leveraging to buy assets sooner. That's just not as a sexier name to sell, I guess. So that's why it doesn't stick. But we will make this calculator also available to anyone who wants to use it. It'll be in an email that we'll send out following the webinar. We do have some of the assumptions we've used in building it, including the investment return assumptions for each of the scenarios. But what we're going to talk about, because as Craig said, there's a lot of numbers, there's a lot of strategy in here. We want to break it down through the playbook just so we can understand, okay, well, what do we really need to think about if we're going to implement something like this, so we can potentially increase our net wealth, by $2 million over a 20-year time frame, and just buy us more optionality. So just coming back to the case study I mentioned, so when we've gone through this whole process for them, we've got funds invested for them. They only wanted to start with $300,000 in debt recycling. Hadn't invested before, quite nervous about the whole strategy, and that's absolutely fine. So although they had the capacity to start at a lot more, we just started with 300. We simplified their asset structure. We reallocated capital tax effectively. So I mentioned the investment bond, there's a little bit done there. As I said before, we also paid down the non-deductible debt. So we actually sold their investment property. They'd only moved out of it relatively recently, so there wasn't much of a CGT bill to pay because it had always been their home before then. And what it showed is that pretty much, even with only starting at $300,000 of debt recycling, with their new savings capacity and everything else we'd allocated for, that they would be mortgage free in about 5 years. Worst case scenario, I think pretty conservatively, because that didn't really rely on the investment returns, it was more their cash flow. It gave FU money for David in that, there's $3,000 a month left over still. We allocated the $50K money budget for an Italy trip. We got the home renovated, and it showed that they're also on track to retire or become financially independent by 60 should they, choose to do that at that stage. So that was a really good case study that I think helped highlight the impact that debt recycling can have. So what we'll do now is we'll move a little bit to the nuts and bolts. Oh, yep.
Could I just ask you, Posty, with that one, this customer, they're in a great spot, right? And it's funny the change between, there's some obviously some work and things that you as you mentioned shifted around, but the demonstrable difference between them knowing where they'll be and not knowing where they'll be is probably the biggest unlock out of all of that too. They would get to a place, and it's probably much better than they even thought from doing nothing.
That's exactly right. I think just being able to help illuminate the path that people are on is one of the biggest things people take away from financial planning, because they might be doing well, but they've got no idea what it actually means. Yeah, I'm building equity, I'm doing this, but where do I land? What does it all actually mean for me at the end of the day? And if we can help people map where they are to where they actually want to be, and show them what sort of time frame it looks like. I think that's, as I said, the biggest thing that people take away from financial planning. It's not necessarily the investments getting a better return in this fund or this share opposed to that fund, or picking the best investment property. It's just saying, hey, what do we want and how do we get it? Yeah. So let's have a look at the playbook. And I think the first thing we need to do, or step one in the playbook, is we want to assess your suitability. So Tez, I'll hand it over to you, because what you do with the cash flow co does centre around some of the initial points. So, if we want to do this, we need to make sure we've got the cash flow to support a strategy like this.
Yeah, so as you say, step number one, or point 1.1 there, is make sure we have an adequate cash cushion. And just to make sure I eat my own breakfast here, let's just break down cash cushion. Cash cushion is really, it's a fund that you have that's there to cushion life's blows. We use the word very specifically, cushion, because I think a lot of people get stuck on savings, as in like, I should never touch my savings. And I find I've met a lot of people that went and took out credit card debt because they didn't want to touch their savings. So we never use the word savings anymore. We use the word cushion, because that's how we want you to use it.
Just, Terry, you said finance is very complicated, but very simply, why is that such a bad idea? What's wrong with getting a credit card to keep my cash?
Because you're adding an obligation every single month to your cash flow. So you're actually draining your cash flow to make yourself feel better in the actual moment. So we do some funny things with money, humans. And that's just one of them. I could go on and on and on about the funny things we do with money. But I guess the first part here is just to make sure that you have enough of a cash cushion with this, because you want to make sure that you're not going to be shaken out of any position. You're not going to feel the volatility that can come with the exposure that you have to risk, to where you have your money invested, and just feel so like you could do this consistently. So a couple of things that we keep in mind for a cash cushion, to know that you've got an adequate cash cushion. It's a very personal, number for you, but there are some ways that you can think about it. So there's two parts I like to think about it. So there's the financial sort of considerations, and then there's a psychological consideration as well. So you have to think about things like, on the financial side, do you have dependents? If you have more dependents, obviously you're going to want a bigger cash cushion. Mm-hmm. You want to also think about, and probably no one really thinks about this, but probably the most important, what about your industry and your job, that stability of that income? Is it growing? Are you in an industry where it's growing? Are you in an industry where it's really steady, like, for example, medicine? Or are you in an industry that's declining, like print media? These are all going to be considerations for how big of a cash cushion you need to have. I met a lot of people who have way too big a cash cushion. There's a lot of people who work in the healthcare industry, and they've got such demand for what they do. They can get such great terms with loans, and they just carry too much in cash. And so we do a bit of education around that. If it's like, you're a GP, you've got no kids, you're in high demand, you're not going anywhere, you don't plan to change careers anytime soon, you really don't need $100,000 in savings. You can start putting some of that money to work. So you want to think about dependence, you want to think about industry, job, security. You also want to think about how many income streams you actually have. If you only have one, that's a bit different to having two or three. Do you have any paid sick leave available to you? Do you have cash equivalents? Is there already money that you could access in offset or redraw? What about your insurance waiting periods? And what about backup income potential? How easy would it be for you to replace that income if you needed to? And then if you look online, you can start to look at what's the actual average time that it takes somebody to find a job in that space that you're in right now as well. Take all those things into consideration to start to think about how much of a cash cushion you need. We like to think about it in terms of months. So, for example, let's say it costs you $10,000 a month to live. Having $10,000 in savings would be a 1 month cash cushion. And that's not a very big cash cushion. If someone with a family, usually it's somewhere between 3 to 6 months is where they're sort of sitting, and it's very personal. And that's the sort of the second consideration, right? So we've thought about the financial side of this, dependence, industry, all those kind of things I just listed off. The other side of the coin is, how do you deal with uncertainty, or the concept or the prospect of uncertainty? If you have a very low tolerance for uncertainty, then you want to push that cash cushion up a little bit, because yes, this all makes sense in a spreadsheet, but like I said before, if you feel like everything's at risk and you're more likely to get shaken out of your position or shaken out of this strategy, it's not a big enough cash cushion, or it's the wrong strategy for you. I'm not sure if you want me to cover anything else off, mate, but I think they're the main things when it comes to cash cushion.
Yeah, no, I think very comprehensive too, because one of the other terms that's bandied around there, I think maybe the Barefoot Investor has it as this, but emergency fund. And I think a lot of people can just 3 times expenses, get an emergency fund, and they don't really think about how it applies for them. Financial planning is inherent, very personal, and we should think about all the things that you just mentioned rather than just following someone else's rules who may be on a completely different path to the one we're on. And I think one other thing I've found is actually defining what's an emergency, or what are some of the events where I give myself permission to go into this cash cushion. Because a lot of it, it's grey. We don't really know, and I think giving yourself permission ahead of time just makes it a lot clearer and a lot easier for people too to understand. Okay, well, it's a cash cushion, and here's what it's for. Here's when I touch it. Here's when it's going to help cushion the last blows, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
What about
repeatable surplus? Yeah. So
yeah, absolutely.
A lot of people probably don't know what this is. And it's very valuable to have because, I think you mentioned before in your example post you had $3,000 a month. And now that would have been done as a one-time kind of let's go through it. But you actually want to know how that's changing across time as well, because every year happens in seasons. There is no such thing as an average month. There's always seasons where you're spending more and seasons where you're spending less. And so you want to get a good sense of what is pretty realistic for you to be able to fund long term, because that should give you confidence in what you can consistently fund and what's realistic for you in terms of the balance between living well now and funding the future as well. Because if you push it too far to the future and every single extra spare cent is pushed towards the future goals, there will be a part of you that'll push back at some point. And that part of you is going to drop the 20 or 30 grand on the trip to Italy. Even if you can't afford it, you're just going to make it happen. So you really want to find what we call dynamic balance, the rate at which you're saving without a sense of sacrifice, because it's not really hurting you too much. You're still being able to honour and spend in line with what you value today, but save towards that vision for tomorrow as well. And the way we do that is always making sure that we're sort of forecasting forward 12 months, but we're also mapping forward every single dollar to the month ahead and then tracking back against that plan for the month to actually look at how that plays out. That really does help you understand what is realistic for you in terms of monthly surplus.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for that, mate. So we've got a cash cushion. We've figured out, what's our repeatable monthly surplus on average, noting that there is no average month. But what's the next step, Craig? It's usually going to someone like yourself and saying, gimme, gimme, gimme.
Yeah, that's nice as a step in there, but I think it's also then it's just deploying the things that you already have. I think our sections are a little bit more easy to understand. Like equity in these concepts are known, right? So equity is the difference between the value of your home and what you owe to the bank. That's essentially the easiest way to look at it. The challenge is getting what that value is, and so there's, go online to realestate.com or Domain. It's going to give you an estimate. If you're in a metro area, that's a lot easier than if you're in regional. But essentially, you need to know what the bank will lend you. So valuations come as a big tool here. And if you're already working with a broker, these are things that you can access relatively easily. So obtaining a valuation from multiple banks is a good idea to understand from a banking perspective what is the value, and therefore you could work out what the equity is when you know your loan position as well.
Yep. And then the next part on that, once we've figured out, like I'm below an 80% LVR, the bank has some equity that they're willing to lend against, is then will the bank trust me to pay the loan back, right?
Correct. So and this comes down to your ability to repay that loan. And so the banks have their metrics for working out how that looks. But again, it'll be an assessment of what you're earning, what that profile looks like, and then understanding with the different lenders what that number is. And so a general rule of thumb, it's not specific, but if you look at 4 to 5 times your gross income, will give you a range of money that the banks will lend. Obviously, it's far more detailed than that when you get into it, but as a general range, you could work out what that looks like. And therefore, if you're looking at it and you are looking to invest and you've got the equity and you've got a $600,000 loan, but your income might be $120,000, just because you've got the equity doesn't mean the bank will give you the money, even if you wanted to go and get that extra $300,000 as per your scenario. So you have to be able to have the equity, and then you have to be able to access that equity through the bank's assessment to be able to use this strategy.
Awesome. Yeah. So moving over to step 2, once we know our personal position, we know that the banks are able to lend us some money. What we want to do is assess your ambition. So how much risk do I want to take to achieve the goals and objectives that I've set out for myself for that good life? Do I want to take on a lot of risk? Do I want to be more conservative? And while I want to put some of my equity to work and I'm happy to invest, I still want to prioritise paying off the home loan. And there's a lot of videos out there too, again on YouTube, is, paying off your mortgage is one of the worst mistakes you can make according to the math. But it was interesting text, like we watched one of those again the other day preparing for this, and the top 20 comments on it were all like, yeah, but nothing can replace the feeling of not having a home loan anymore. Okay, so just understanding where you sit in your ambition is really important, because then it helps to define the strategy for you. How much of your surplus cash flow do we want to commit to this new investment loan? What in your surplus cash flow do we want to commit to either the investment, or do we want to prioritise paying off the debt? The next thing we want to look at too is just defining the timeline. If I've got really fixed goals and objectives that are probably shorter than even 10 years, we really want to have a think about whether this is something that's suitable for us. Not all of our goals and objectives have definitive timelines. There's a few. I want to send the kids to private school. Okay, well, that's usually going to happen when the kids are 12. Usually. I mean, some people might want to send them to primary school, or some might get to 12 and think, you know what, they can wait till year 9. But, typically there's a fixed window at which we want to, achieve goals and objectives like that. So once we understand our timelines, again, it might be open-ended. I just want to get to financial independence as quick as possible, but it's at least 10 years away based on the math. Okay, so we've got a rough understanding of what our timeline is, because then that also helps us assess how much risk we should be taking, because like the Warren Buffett analogy, the longer I have to invest, the least riskier it basically is. The next thing we want to understand too is, what should the ownership of our assets be? Okay. Craig, Terry, why do you think we might need to consider that if I'm in a relationship, or, there's other reasons why we might need to think about it?
I'll leave this one to you, Craig.
I think it sort of does link a little bit to multiple things. So there's tax consequences of ownership, there's borrowing impacts of ownership, and that's not only just now, and then there's upon sale of the asset. They all have a bearing of the net result. So if you go back to that original calculation that you did, that is if you looked at the gross numbers, and then if you want to sell those investments at that time, there is a tax implication of that too, and that can be very different depending on the ownership. And so I think if you're looking at all of these different things, it's like mapping the journey, mapping the need, and then understanding what you need at those different times can really help determine what course of action is the best one here, and ownership certainly is one of those to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, spot on. And then once we've figured out the above 3, we can really start to look and design, what's our asset mix going to be. So I spoke about the investment preferences before. Are we focusing something that's got a little higher income? Are we focusing on something that's a little bit more diversified? Or, do we want to just chase investment growth at potentially the trade-off with, getting higher income from our investments? Step 3, and again, a little bit more practical, Craig. This one is, we can borrow money. We've got the cash flow to support it. We know what the investment plan is when we get the money. How do we then go about implementing it? Because the first step is to actually then get the money off the bank.
Yeah, and I think the review of the existing loan's a great first point, because if your current lender can do this, then it doesn't mean wholesale changes. And I think that's always a really good place to start. So just seeing what your current facility allows for is the best place to go. It's, you know, you pay about $1,000 to switch lending institutions, and all these things eat into the benefits of what you do. So ideally, not only do you not have to disrupt your direct debits and all that sort of thing, if you can do it where you are, not only is it easier, but it's often better for you as well. So that's a good place to start. Designate the name. So you want to understand with your other advisors, what does this look like? What does the journey look like? Whose name should the loan be in? Is it individuals? Is it trusts? Whatever it might be that your advisors have aligned, then we need to make sure that the lending supports that strategy. And then applying for the loan split. So essentially, this is all about segregation of that deductible and non-deductible debt, as we touched on in an earlier slide. If we've got the purpose of a loan being mixed, we've got big problems. And what I mean by that is, if you've got your home loan and your investment loan in one big facility, it doesn't mean it can't work. It's just messier, because it looks at a percentage of the loan that is for investment, which is the deductible part, and then a percentage of it that is for your home, which is non-deductible, and your accountant will hate you. It's really hard to keep clean. So for simplicity, for cleanliness, you'd want to make sure that each loan has a purpose.
Yeah. And it's actually, I'm going to say 3 to 4 times just this calendar year, Cruz, we've had new clients come to us that, you know, started implementing a strategy like this, felt a little bit unsure. I mean, you know, we've had some shaky markets the last month or two as well. And when we've reviewed things, we've identified, well, hang on, you've applied for this loan split, you've put some money in the investment, and then you've moved the other funds over to your offset account against your other mortgage. That's a mixed purpose. How are we going to track this? It just makes things a bit more difficult. Not that it's like an illegal thing to do, but as you, Craig, said, you know, your accountant's going to hate you. It's very difficult to track it from then on, and then, you know, you can run into problems with the ATO.
And I think as well, it's just stacking those small wins, isn't it? You know, like it's about having a process for doing this. And I think if you go through each of these checklists, there's doing it well. And it's not to say the result won't be there, but is it the result that it could have been? If you just do these things, and some of these things are really hard to unravel. So going back and unscrambling the eggs, quite challenging sometimes. So the right time to do it is to get it up started in the correct way, and therefore it becomes a maintenance thing as opposed to a renovation at the time that you need to.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. And then step 4, so we've got the money off the bank, we've got the designated names, we've got the loan splits, our cash is there ready to be invested. I'm a big believer in understanding and, you know, having an exit criteria. What's our exit plan for this? Once our home loan's paid off, or the non-deductible debt, are we going to keep investing surplus money, or are we going to use that surplus money to then extinguish the investment loan? Once our home loan's paid off, are we going to keep leveraging against that to, you know, maybe max out our borrowing capacity or max out the LVR? What's our exit criteria? What's our exit criteria for the investment portfolio? Is it we don't ever exit it at all? Is it it's there to provide for financial independence, and if we're really, really lucky, we could sell a portion of it down and give the kids a house deposit in 15 years as well? But just really understanding what that exit criteria is, because I think the biggest problem with investing is people changing course all the time. Because they're not really set on what these funds are for, and the new idea comes up and we change course. And investing is a bit like a bar of soap. The more we touch it, the less there is. And like Craig said before with the debt, you know, even $1,000 just to change lenders all the time can really eat into your returns. Okay, so we've defined that. We're ready to go. We need to pick our platform. You know, what's going to hold our investments. Okay, so, you know, a lot of people will be familiar with brokerages or direct platforms. That's just an environment where we can purchase our different investments, whether that's ETFs, direct shares, whatever it may be. So once we've decided on that, we then go and actually make the investment. Okay, we've picked our products, we've picked the investment portfolio, we go and purchase our investments. Okay. Now, a lot of these platforms and some of these brokerages, they also have really nifty features too. Okay, so we can set our execution rules. So we can leave this to be automated in some respects. So one thing that a lot of people want to think about is, okay, well, some of these products I'm going to invest in will pay dividends. How regularly do those dividends come in? Is this something that I want to go into, see my portfolio? It's like the pokies. There's lights flashing, green numbers because our portfolios gone up. We get excited. Sometimes the better thing is just to keep yourself out of it and let some of these features just do it themselves, okay? And you delete the app. You don't even check it, all right? The other thing with that is, what's the execution rules around your buy-in? So if I've just borrowed $300,000, Trump could say something stupid or smart, depending on which side of that coin you sit on, and your investment goes down, by 20% straight away. So do we want a dollar cost averaging strategy as a part of our execution to purchasing the investments? Okay, we've set all that up. Everything's getting automated to an extent. The last thing we want to do is, okay, at what cadence do we want to review this? What cadence do we want to look at how the investment performing? Do we need to change the strategy? Do we need to look at debt recycling again because house prices in Melbourne have gone up by 10% in the last 12 months? No one in Melbourne's heard that for the last 6 years, but we wish. We'll wait. Okay. Now, in this webinar so far, we've obviously touched on shares. We've spoken about the pros, or largely, the strategy in relation to shares, but this can equally be applied to property. Okay, we're really asset agnostic. There's a lot of benefits to property. We've listed out some of the pros and the cons here. Terry, I'll maybe get you to touch on the pros of shares and then and the cons, and then Bigsy, if you're happy to just quickly touch on the pros and cons of property.
Yeah, I think with shares, this one really, you probably just knowing yourself as an investor will help immensely. I like to think of a spectrum of active versus passive as an investor. If you're active, you kind of like the drama, you like to get involved, you like to do things, you like to make decisions. But if you're more passive and you don't really want to think about this, you don't really want it to take away from focus at work or focus on family and things like that, then you're more of a passive investor. And generally, as a generalization, more passive investors do better with shares, more active investors do better with property. And that's the biggest pro of shares. I kind of think about it like this and say, imagine you could be having the benefit of leverage, maybe not as much as with property, but the benefit of leverage to have a tenant in a property that's growing, but this tenant never leaves. They never break anything. Nothing in the house ever needs fixing. None of those phone calls are ever going to happen for you. All you've got to do is just keep shoveling money into it over time. And so if you appreciate that and you want it to be more simpler in that sense, then shares is a really good option for you. The downside of that is we just don't get as much leverage. So we can't build as big a capital base as quickly as we could with property. And also we cannot unlock and release growth from the property that we invested in to buy another property with shares. We always have to be kind of building up from what we actually have. So a little bit different there in that sense. But I think the big question is are you more active or are you more passive? If you can answer that question, this will help you a lot.
Yeah, awesome. It's a really great way to think about it. Craig, property?
I think as Terry touched on, there are some pros for property. Like greater leverage is one of them. And so that's the ability to borrow not only against your home, but against the investment property that you purchase. And that's both against the asset and then also the additional borrowing capacity that is allowed to you based on the rental income that comes from that property. Whereas you can't necessarily, it's not always the case, but can't necessarily borrow against the income that comes from your share portfolio. I think the other thing about property which can't be overlooked is that you can manufacture growth in your asset. So I think most people at some point in their life are either have done or will do some improvements to their home, and you may have already seen the benefits that can do for the valuation of your property. The same thing happens with your investments. So if you're able to do the kitchen and bathrooms and do some landscaping and you see an uplift in the value of the home and the uplift of the rent that you can then charge, that's something that is unique to property that you can't really go and renovate your share portfolio necessarily and manufacture those things too. I think lower volatility is probably a little bit of a misnomer in some ways. I think the volatility still sits there. It's just we don't know about it, right? So we don't really know what the volatility is on our property until such time as we sell or buy because we don't really know what the real value is. So I think if you look at it long enough, both are volatile. So I think probably the other two are the greater pros of property in that sense. The cons are absolutely the higher entry costs. So you've got your stamp duty, your agent fees, all that sort of thing that come into it with buying property. You're typically needing more money to start. So that entry cost is typically higher when it comes to property, where you'll know the numbers posted in terms of minimum investment into shares. The minimum investment into property isn't $1,000. So unexpected expenses. Personal story: we've just had re-stumping in our investment property. Didn't see that one coming on top of the door that we just fixed. And higher concentration risk. You generally just have less properties. There are some investors now that are getting some substantial property portfolios when you're talking, 10, 15 assets across different markets. But typically most people, if you look at the numbers, have their home and maybe one or two maximum other properties. So you are concentrated to the areas in which you buy. And as Chris Bates has always said, property's a whole lot of micro markets. Even suburbs have different markets. There's good parts of a suburb, bad parts of a suburb. So, but you really are locked into the place and the market that you've bought into, which is unique to the property that you bought.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that, boys. Just getting mindful of time. So I think step 5 is probably also the most important one. And Tez, given the work you do on the offense and defense side of things in the cash flow co, I wanted you just to a little elaborate on, what step 5 actually is.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to me. We will have, we're very engaged in conversations like this in terms of our financial capital and how we invest it. I see less often people being very proactive about their human capital and how we continue to invest in that beyond formal education. And so one of the things that we try to do, the easiest way to say without sacrifice is to increase your top line, is to increase your income. And there is kind of a plan and a way that you can kind of work your way through that. If you want to increase demand for what you do, the easiest way to do that is to cut supply. And the way to cut supply is to figure out what you do uniquely well that very few people can compete with you on. And there's 3 areas that we look into. And just to give you context as to why this matters so much, I think a lot of people probably mistakenly think that the risk with debt recycling is what happens in the markets. It's not at all. It's actually what happens with your cash flow. If you can't consistently fund this, then this strategy is not going to work for you long term. So if you want to focus on the things that you can actually control, getting back to investing in yourself and making sure that you can keep increasing your income, keep siphoning it off and improving your borrowing capacity, that is the best thing that you can do. That's the biggest risk. And when you address that as a constraint, it's also the biggest constraint to how well you can do with this strategy. So I like to think about 3 things when it comes to this. I like to think about aptitude, I like to think about deep domain knowledge, and I like to think about action bias. So aptitude is what you kind of have an intuition for, what you do naturally well. And the best way to think about you figuring out what you're really, really good at and what you've got an aptitude for is to think about the role you played in your family unit. Think about what you were reinforced for. Because it's not the skills, it's not the formal qualifications you have at work that separate or differentiate you. It's actually the intangible things, the way that you actually get the job done. So maybe you are a problem solver at home. And maybe you're the person who took control of these situations and you kind of led the way forward. That's the thing that separates and differentiates you. Your aptitudes are going to be the result of the things that you are reinforced for, your role in the family unit. The second thing I think about is your deep domain knowledge. I believe that everybody has a burning question in their life that leads to very, very deep domain knowledge. It might sound kind of weird and eccentric, but it is a differentiator in the right context. And so everybody has this burning question, which is, for me, I'm just obsessed with this question of how do people change? How do we help people change for the better? So it's no surprise that I find myself in coaching situations all the time. And everybody has that question. If you ask yourself that question, what is my burning question? What's the question? What's the thing that I am just innately curious about that the more I know, the more I want to know? That is going to be a very, very valuable thing for you to think about because that's where you're going to add immense expertise. The last thing is action bias. So your action bias is the way that you get results. Everybody gets results in a very different way. And the best way to understand your action bias is to think about the things people criticize you for. When somebody says to you, geez, I wish you weren't so X, or I wish you're just so Why? Whenever those people make those comments, usually what they're talking about is the thing that you're naturally doing all the time, the thing that you're getting like almost obsessive, and you just continue to want to do it. If you can figure out those three things, your aptitudes, your domains, your action bias, what you're going to be able to do is figure out these are the things that I do uniquely well that separate and differentiate me. And then what you want to do is you want to map that back to a context that finds those things, the combination and convergence of those things, exceedingly valuable. And I think Craig's a fantastic example of this, mate. Hopefully you're not too embarrassed by this, but I think you're probably one of the best systems thinkers that I've seen. And I think that's what makes you an excellent owner of a mortgage broking business. You've obviously built a team of brokers, but it's the systems you guys use and the way that it works seamlessly to create more space for a human interaction. And you seem to have just kind of, I guess, you've done this in a different context with financial planning in the past. You now do it with this space with mortgage broking. But it adds a lot of value in that space because there's a lot of movement of paperwork through this. So I hope I'm not embarrassing you there, mate, but I just wanted to give you like a real example of where these things come together and where you can add a lot of value. So if you want to get back to investing in yourself, you want to think about those three things: aptitudes, domain knowledge, and action bias.
Yep. And like you said at the start, Tez, the quickest way to save without sacrificing is actually to increase your top line. If I can earn another 20 grand a year after tax for the next 20 years, well, there's 400 grand I've just created for myself with, a little bit of work on myself to figure out those three domains.
Yeah. And it's so much easier to add $500 of income. If you think about the impact of adding $500 to your saving capacity versus finding an extra $500, it's actually far greater. Far greater.
Yeah. No, absolutely, mate. That pretty much wraps us up. If there anyone that has any questions, we're happy to stick around for another couple of minutes. But otherwise, any other closing comments, Craig, Terry? I think it's been quite comprehensive so far in the hour we've had. But we'll obviously share the recording out with people. We'll give people access to the simulator as well. But also perhaps, where can anyone watching this find out more about, the work you do, Terry, and, you yourself as well, Craig?
Just for me, mate, cashflowco.com.au is our website. We do have a podcast. It's Money Minded is the podcast. We've been doing that for a while. So that's a really good place to get started with our work as well.
And for me, it's just the Alcove website. So if you do that or connect on LinkedIn, I'm not as prolific with the content production as you guys are. I hung that hat up long ago. So.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks very much for joining me, guys. Thanks for all your input and, experience and technical expertise. Hopefully, anyone watching along or that accesses a recording from this will get a huge amount of value. And, I'm sure you both are open to help anyone else that wants to go down that path and look at this in a little bit more detail.
Thanks for having us, Jayden.
Thanks, mate.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, everyone.